Right now, as you watch this, a rover on Mars is streaming high-definition video back to Earth. It is driving across red dust, drilling into ancient rock, sending us images so sharp you can count the pebbles. Mars is 225 million kilometers away on average. Venus is 40 million kilometers away at its closest point, less than a fifth of that distance, the nearest planet to Earth in the entire solar system. And the last photograph ever taken from its surface was captured in 1982, not a radar map, not a computer rendering, not an artist's impression based on data, an actual optical photograph taken by a Soviet probe that had exactly 127 minutes to live before the planet killed it. Every image of Venus you have ever seen since then, every dramatic landscape, every glowing surface shot, every detailed terrain view is either a radar reconstruction, a digitally colorized topographic model, or an illustration. None of them show you what Venus actually looks like standing on the ground. We do not know. We have not looked, not once in over 40 years. Here's what makes this genuinely unsettling. New data from NASA's Parker Solar Probe, combined with a reanalysis of decades-old radar records, is now suggesting something that scientists are choosing their words very carefully around. Venus may not be the dead world we assumed it was. If that turns out to be correct, every model we have built to understand how rocky planets evolve, including the ones we are applying right now to thousands of worlds orbiting other stars, needs to be reconsidered from the beginning. Subscribe to follow this wherever the data leads. Now, let's begin. To understand why the new data is so disruptive, you first need to understand what Venus and Earth are supposed to be to each other. They formed at the same moment approximately 4.5 billion years ago from the same rotating disk of gas and dust surrounding the early sun. Venus has 95% of Earth's mass, 95% of Earth's radius, nearly identical bulk composition. If you place them side by side in the early solar system before anything had time to diverge, a geologist from the future would have looked at both and said, these two are going to turn out the same. They did not. Earth has liquid oceans, a breathable atmosphere, and a surface temperature that averages around 15 degrees Celsius. Venus has a surface temperature of 475 degrees Celsius, hot enough to melt lead, zinc, and tin simultaneously. Its atmosphere is 90 times denser than Earth's, composed almost entirely of carbon dioxide, with clouds of sulfuric acid drifting through its upper layers. A human being exposed to the Venusian surface would be simultaneously crushed, cooked, and chemically dissolved before they had time to register any of it. The standard explanation for this divergence involves what scientists call a runaway greenhouse effect. Think of it this way. Imagine a car parked in full sunlight with every window sealed shut. Heat enters through the glass but cannot escape. Now imagine that process running for billions of years on a planetary scale with no mechanism to stop it. That is what carbon dioxide did to Venus. Like, it turned the atmosphere into a one-way valve for heat. And once that process crossed a certain threshold, nothing could reverse it. But here is where the story becomes complicated. When NASA's Magellan spacecraft mapped the Venusian surface using radar between 1990 and 1994, it revealed something that did not fit the model of a world that had simply overheated and died. The average age of Venus's surface is estimated at somewhere between 300 and 600 million years. In geological terms, that is extraordinarily young. Earth's oldest surface regions are over 4 billion years old. Something erased the old surface of Venus and replaced it with something new, geologically speaking, not long ago at all. The question that has been sitting unanswered ever since is a simple one. What did that, and is it finished? This is where the data gets uncomfortable. In 2021, NASA's Parker Solar Probe executed one of its routine gravity assist maneuvers, using Venus's gravitational pull to bend its trajectory closer to the sun. Parker was not designed to study Venus. Venus was simply a convenient anchor point in the mathematics of orbital mechanics. But during that flyby, an instrument called WISPR, the Wide Field Imager for Solar Probe, captured something nobody had specifically planned for. It captured heat, not reflected sunlight, not cloud formations, thermal emission, infrared radiation bleeding upward through a narrow atmospheric window originating from the surface itself. For the first time since 1982, something built by human hands was seeing the ground of Venus. Not with optical light, not in the way a camera sees, but seeing it nonetheless in the language of heat signatures and temperature gradients. What those images showed was a landscape that was not uniform. Certain elevated regions, particularly the highland plateaus of Aphrodite Terra and a formation called Ovda Regio, appeared measurably brighter in the infrared than the surrounding lowland plains. In the thermal map Parker returned, those highlands glowed. The researchers who published this data in Geophysical Research Letters in 2022 were careful with their language, deliberately, professionally careful. Their conclusion was that the brightness pattern was, and this is a direct characterization of their phrasing, consistent with the presence of minerals that have not been significantly weathered by the Venusian atmosphere. Fresh minerals, minerals that may not have been exposed to that atmosphere for very long. That is not a confirmation of volcanic activity. It is something more precise and in some ways more provocative. It is a signal that something on the surface of Venus may be recent in geological terms and that our existing models did not predict it would be there. Then came the Magellan reanalysis. In 2023, a research team led by Robert Herrick at the University of Alaska Fairbanks went back to the raw radar data collected by Magellan across its multiple orbital passes in the early 1990s. The radar did not image Venus once. It imaged it repeatedly with passes separated by months. By comparing those passes carefully, Herrick's team identified something that should not have been possible if Venus were geologically dead. A volcanic vent on the flanks of Mart Mons, the tallest volcano on Venus, rising approximately 9 kilometers above the surrounding plains, had changed shape between two radar passes separated by approximately 8 months. In the first image, the vent opening covered an area of roughly 2.2 square kilometers. In the second image, that same vent had expanded to approximately 4 square kilometers and altered its outline substantially. Radar artifacts were considered and tested against multiple signal processing approaches. The change remained. To put this in terms that make the scale clear, a volcanic vent on another planet visibly changed shape within 8 months, and we only discovered this 30 years later by going back to data that was sitting in an archive. Neither finding, taken alone, constitutes proof of active volcanism on Venus today. The Parker infrared data tells us about surface composition, not about whether magma is moving beneath it right now. The Magellan vent change tells us something shifted between two radar passes, but radar at 75-meter resolution leaves room for interpretation. What both findings share is this: they were not predicted. The model said Venus was a world that had burned itself out. The data is suggesting, with increasing consistency across independent sources, that the models may have been looking at a snapshot and mistaking it for the whole story. Here is the problem stated as plainly as possible. Every rocky planet in our solar system follows a pattern that our models predict with reasonable confidence. Larger planets retain internal heat longer. Smaller planets cool faster. Their geological engines wind down and their surfaces freeze into permanence. Mars, roughly half the diameter of Earth, lost its magnetic field and most of its volcanic activity billions of years ago. The Moon, smaller still, has been geologically quiet for even longer. The pattern is consistent and the physics behind it is well understood. Venus does not follow the pattern. It is nearly the same size as Earth. By every calculation we have, it should be behaving similarly. Active tectonics, ongoing volcanic outgassing, dynamic interior exchanging heat with the surface through some organized geological process. And yet the surface we mapped shows no evidence of the plate tectonic system that drives Earth's geological recycling. The crust of Venus appears to be a single rigid shell, what geologists call a stagnant lid, sitting over a hot interior with no mechanism to release pressure gradually. Think of it this way. Earth's crust is like a cracked eggshell, dozens of fragments constantly grinding past each other, diving beneath one another, releasing heat and pressure in a continuous managed process. Venus appears to have a crust that is one solid unbroken shell. No cracks, no release valves, just a lid sitting over an interior that is still generating heat from the radioactive decay of elements locked inside it since the planet formed. That heat has to go somewhere. The leading hypothesis, and it is important to be precise, that this remains a hypothesis under active investigation, not an established conclusion, is called episodic resurfacing. The idea is that Venus does not release its internal heat gradually and continuously the way Earth does. Instead, it holds that heat for hundreds of millions of years, pressure building beneath the rigid lid until the system reaches a breaking point. Then, in a geologically brief and catastrophic episode, the entire surface is overturned by massive volcanic activity. The old crust is buried under new lava flows, and the clock resets. If this model is correct, it would explain the young surface age that Magellan measured. It would also raise a question that nobody has a comfortable answer to. Where are we in that cycle right now? The honest scientific answer is that we do not know. We have one radar data set from the early 1990s, 2 infrared observations from Parker, and a reanalysis that found a changed volcanic vent. That is not enough data to locate ourselves on the timeline of a process that may operate on a scale of hundreds of millions of years. What the data does tell us is that the stagnant lid model in its simplest form is no longer sufficient. Something is happening inside Venus. The question science has not yet answered is whether we are watching the quiet interval or the beginning of something else entirely. Stop thinking about Venus for a moment. Think about the air you just breathed in, the temperature in the room where you are sitting right now, the fact that liquid water exists on the surface of this planet in quantities large enough to fill oceans and has existed that way without interruption for nearly 4 billion years. None of that is guaranteed. None of it is the default state of a rocky planet orbiting a star. Venus is the proof. Venus did not begin as a hell. Current climate models, based on its distance from the sun and its likely early composition, suggest it may have sustained liquid oceans for as long as 2 to 3 billion years. Longer by some estimates than complex life has existed on Earth. Something changed. A threshold was crossed. And once it was crossed, the process that followed was not gradual. It was a cascade. Each increment of warming released more carbon dioxide from the rocks. More carbon dioxide trapped more heat. More heat released more carbon dioxide. The feedback loop had no ceiling and no break. Here's the number that is worth sitting with. The concentration of carbon dioxide in Earth's atmosphere as of April 2026 is approximately 427 parts per million. On Venus, that concentration is 965,000 parts per million. The distance between those two numbers is not fixed. It is not protected by any physical law. It is the result of a balance that has held so far. You are not watching a story about a distant planet. You are watching a case study in what happens when a planetary atmosphere crosses a line it cannot uncross. Venus is not a warning from science fiction. It is a warning from the solar system itself, like sitting 40 million kilometers away, visible to the naked eye on any clear night, bright enough that people throughout history mistook it for a star. The closest planet to Earth, the most Earth-like planet in mass and size, and a surface that nothing built by human hands has touched since 1982. That proximity is not coincidental. It is the point. Intellectual honesty requires something that most science content skips over entirely. Everything presented in the previous sections is real. The Parker infrared observations were published in a peer-reviewed journal. The Magellan vent reanalysis was conducted by a credentialed research team and has been independently examined. None of that is in dispute. But data requires interpretation, and interpretation is where reasonable scientists disagree. So the conservative position deserves a precise and fair articulation before we treat these observations as settled evidence of a broken model. The skeptical argument goes like this. The brightness anomalies detected by Parker's WHISPER instrument may reflect ancient crustal composition rather than recent geological activity. Highland regions on Venus are known to contain materials that behave differently in the infrared. Tessera terrain, for example, is thought to represent some of the oldest surviving crust on the planet, and its unusual mineral composition could produce exactly the thermal signature Parker observed without requiring any fresh volcanic output whatsoever. As for the Martmons vent, radar imaging at 75-meter resolution across passes taken from slightly different orbital geometries introduces real potential for geometric distortion. The change looked real after multiple processing approaches. Yeah, but the data set is thin, and thin data sets have fooled careful scientists before. These are legitimate arguments. They deserve to be taken seriously. But here is where the skeptical position begins to strain under its own weight. The Parker observation and the Magellan reanalysis are independent. They use completely different instruments, completely different physical principles, and were conducted by separate research teams with no coordination between them. For both to be simultaneously explained away as artifacts or misinterpretations of ancient geology requires a coincidence that grows less statistically comfortable the longer you examine it. There is also a precedent worth remembering. In 2004, researchers examining Cassini data initially attributed certain surface features on Titan to instrumental artifacts. Those features were later confirmed as lakes of liquid methane, the first stable bodies of surface liquid ever identified on a world other than Earth. The artifact explanation was reasonable. It was also wrong. The universe does not arrange its revelations to fit the timeline of our confidence. It simply continues operating, and occasionally the data catches up. The conservative position on Venus is not unreasonable. But the history of planetary science suggests that when two independent data sets from two independent instruments both point toward the same unexpected conclusion, the most productive response is not to explain them away. It is to build the instruments that can settle the question permanently. Those instruments are coming. For the first time in decades, Venus has a queue. 3 major missions developed independently by NASA and the European Space Agency are currently in various stages of development and are all targeting Venus within approximately the same window. That convergence is not accidental. It reflects the degree to which the scientific community has recognized that the questions Venus is now asking cannot be answered by the data we already have. The first is Da Vinci, which stands for Deep Atmosphere Venus Investigation of Noble Gases, Chemistry and Imaging. Currently targeting a launch no earlier than 2031, Da Vinci will drop a specially hardened probe into the Venusian atmosphere. That probe will not attempt to land in the conventional sense. Right? It will fall, spending approximately 63 minutes descending through the atmospheric layers, collecting chemical measurements the entire way down before reaching the surface. Its primary target is noble gases, argon, neon, xenon, and their isotopic ratios. Think of noble gases as geological fingerprints. Unlike most elements, they do not react with their surroundings. They preserve the chemical signature of the conditions that existed when the planet first formed, and they can tell us whether Venus ever had water in quantities significant enough to sustain the kind of chemistry that on Earth eventually produced life. The second mission is Veritas, Venus Emissivity, Radioscience, INSAR, Topography, and Spectroscopy, where Magellan mapped Venus at 75-meter resolution. Veritas is designed to image the surface at resolutions approaching 15 to 30 meters, an improvement of roughly 100 times. More importantly, it will image the same locations repeatedly over time. If Martmons is actively changing, Veritas will document it with a clarity that removes ambiguity entirely. If the surface is static, that too will be confirmed. Veritas was delayed due to budgetary constraints, but remains an approved NASA mission with a target launch window in the early 2030s. The third is Envision, developed by the European Space Agency, also targeting launch around 2031. Envision will focus particularly on detecting sulfur dioxide signatures in the lower atmosphere, fresh volcanic gases that would indicate active outgassing happening right now at this moment beneath those clouds. What makes this convergence genuinely significant is the methodology it represents. No single mission will answer the question of whether Venus is currently active, but 3 missions using 3 different measurement approaches, observing the same planet across the same decade. That is how scientific consensus is actually built, not through a single dramatic revelation, but through the accumulation of independent lines of evidence that either reinforce each other or expose the contradictions between them. By the mid-2030s, we will know one way or another, Venus will have run out of places to hide. The last photograph taken from the surface of Venus was captured in 1982, not by a rover with months of operational life ahead of it, not by a station designed for long-term observation, by a titanium sphere that had 127 minutes before the planet it was sitting on dissolved it entirely. That image, orange rocks under an orange sky, sharp-edged and strange, remains the closest look humanity has ever taken at the ground of our nearest planetary neighbour. Nothing since has replaced it. Nothing currently in development will place a camera on that surface before the 1930s at the earliest. If then, for over 40 years, the most Earth-like planet in the solar system has been showing us only its clouds. Here is the question that sits underneath everything the new data is pointing toward, and it is more uncomfortable than it first appears. Venus and Earth began the same raw materials, same moment of formation, same position in the architecture of the early solar system. At some point, something diverged. A threshold was crossed. And on one side of that threshold is everything you have ever known. Oceans, atmosphere, the specific conditions that allowed 4 billion years of uninterrupted biological complexity to unfold. On the other side is 475 degrees Celsius and 90 atmospheres of pressure and a surface that destroys everything we send to examine it. We do not know exactly where that threshold was. We do not know how close Venus came to staying on the habitable side. We do not know whether what is happening inside Venus right now is the quiet interval between catastrophes or something else. What we know is that the planet is 40 million kilometers away. that it is visible tonight with the naked eye, and that after 40 years of silence, the data is finally starting to say something. Whether we are listening carefully enough is a different question entirely.